Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 6 today after the ark has been moved to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, and the narrator tells us, and we'll hear today, that people, anonymous people, tell King David that Yahweh has blessed the household of Obed-Edom, and now it's time for David to trust that the ark is safe to bring back to the city of David. So as we've been looking on the right side of the screen, you can see we're going through the sequence of acts of consolidating legitimacy of his royal reign. The kinds of things that kings, especially kings like David, who got to be king by basically being a gang leader rather than inheriting it in a dynastic situation, has to prove to people that he's actually their God's representative. And so we've seen how he did that in getting a capital city, how we got a powerful supporter in King Hiram of Tyre, how he showed masculine power and fertility by taking more women and having 11 more named sons, calling upon Yahweh to enable his victory over the Philistines, or something, at least an attack on the Philistines. And now we're looking at the more complex story of the return of the ark. And as we have, looking at this, we've seen how this is specifically parallel to the 1 Samuel story of the ark, which goes from 1 Samuel 4 to 7:2. I've only put part of it up here on the left side of the screen, but you can see some of the patterns that are similar. So in both situations, there was a negative experience of the ark, first from the people of Ekron, who are Philistines, and then from Uzzah, not from Uzzah, but people around Uzzah, who died when he tried to hold on to the ark as it was falling off the cart, and David became afraid, and then something positive happens. In the first story, the people of Beth-Shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest and rejoiced at the ark, and it was safe there, and then it's safe in the house of Obed-Edom, so David will take it back. And the people of Beth-Shemesh eventually were not able to keep it there. They said, who can stand before this? And it ended up in the house of Abinadab. So that's the connection we're seeing here. After 20 years in the house of Abinadab, it's now in this situation. And we've also seen a number of other parallels that extend back to chapter 4, as I've been showing in the last two videos, and we'll see more of those today. In terms of our key words, our section here, which overlaps these different paragraphs here, and I'm going to go all the way through up to this part, but I'm going to skip the part about Mishal and the verse about that here, because we'll do that as a separate video next time, although the narrator inserts that here to set us up for what will follow, but we'll put that all together next time. So in the unit we're looking at here, plainly it's David and Yahweh and the ark. And that's pretty much what's at issue. The house of Israel is there a little bit, and the house of Obed-Edom that we saw last time. Notice we never meet Obed-Edom himself. We never hear from him, never see him. We just hear about the house of Obed-Edom, meaning not just the physical building that he lives in, but his whole household, his whole family. So it's curious that he becomes the key figure with whom the ark is safe, but we never actually meet him or hear a word from him. We'll leave this up as we go through our passage. So we included verse 11 last time, and notice as we get to verse 12, the anonymous messenger who tells David it was told King David, and we see my note below, his own royal informer network is now at work, and similar to whatever informed Hiram and the Philistines that David had been made king in Jerusalem. So it goes out to the distance of Tyre and into Philistia, but it's also coming back to David here. And notice how the message that comes back is virtually identical to the message of the narrator, making a theological judgment that the narrator didn't do. The narrator put two events here in verse 11 in juxtaposition, but did not create a causal connection. The ark remained in the house of Obed-Edom, and Yahweh blessed Obed-Edom and all his household, or all his house. But the messengers make the causal connection because of the ark of God. And that's true in the Hebrew as well. So they draw the theological conclusion that Obed-Edom is blessed, and it's because the ark of God is there. So let's just look at a couple of details. All that belongs to him here, Be'et Kal Asher Lo, suggesting everything is being fertile, his people, his animals, his crops, although no specifics are named. And that's part of the same pattern that we've been seeing both in the taking of the stronghold of Zion and in the battles against the Philistines, that this section is very stylized and there's not much detail. Not that the Bible often has a lot of detail, but there are a lot of gaps that they're just not interested in filling in. They're interested in getting the conclusion, in this case, that David will bring the ark back to the city of David. So David went, and that's what we hear here. Falcom, in doing his deep structural analysis, suggests this is the halfway mark in the chapter, and his arguments are solid, but I'd like to suggest that we can frame it the way I'm showing it in paragraphs here just as well. So David went here and brought up, and we have to ask, what about the 30,000 chosen men we heard in the first verse of the chapter with whom he started? And what we see in these next verses, as you can see already on the left side of the screen, is it sounds like it's David all by himself. David went and brought up the ark. David danced before the Lord. So David, and now all the house of Israel brought the ark up. So the camera puts the focus on David, and everybody else is in the shadow while we see this seemingly solo act. What happened to the cart? What happened to the new cart it was riding on that shook and led the ark to almost fall off the cart that ended up being the cause of Uzzah's death? We don't know anything about the cart or the 30,000 people. They're apparently not part of the story anymore. So if we picture just David going by himself, and the distance here is substantial, if it was really a one-man person coming from Gittim, where we assume Obed-Edom's house is, he is a Gittite, coming back here to Jerusalem. So put back our keywords. So from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David. Notice not to Jerusalem, but to the city of David, the smaller part that David has possession of, with rejoicing. And we only saw rejoicing one other time in 1 Samuel. We'll see it in 1 Kings. Let's look at that one now so we can see the context. All the people went up following him, playing pipes. This is Adonijah's attempt to become king, but fails when the word gets out to Nathan and Bathsheba, and they note that he promised that Solomon would be on the throne. But in the moment we hear this rejoicing over Adonijah apparently about to take the throne. So rejoicing in the streets there and here. And now we hear that there are more people. It's interesting that we hadn't heard that at first. We'll look at my note below from Baden in a moment. Let's listen to the verse. And when those who bore the ark of Yahweh had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. So those, literally, who walked and were lifting the ark, not who bore the ark, but who walked and were lifting it. Again, suggesting the cart has been left aside and these people are just handling it. Like the image I put on last video, where there was no cart in the image from the Tissot painting. So we have that. Let's go back to our note here from Baden. He notes, on the one hand, David was positioning himself as priest, making it clear the ark was now a royal object. On the other hand, the sheer volume of the sacrifices would have sent a clear message regarding David's personal wealth. But one has to ask, what about this volume? It simply says an ox and a fatling, and maybe it's just one thing, as Samora suggests it's a hendaitis, a fatted bull. And the contrast that that Baden is pointing to is back to 1 King, where there were huge sacrifices. King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen they could not be counted or numbered. So certainly the uncountable number is very different than an ox and a fatling, or maybe simply a fatted calf. And I'd suggest that when we look at the food elements too, it's really showing the poverty of the whole situation, not David's wealth, but how impoverished he is as this starts, simply offering one ox or perhaps 2 animals here. And we'll come back to that in a minute when we look at the burnt offerings in verse 17. So David danced before Yahweh with all his might. We saw this phrase earlier, with all his might, with all their might, when all the tambourines and things were coming, but that wasn't actually what the Hebrew said there. But here it is, with all his strength, Oz here, fulfilling 2:10. In this little prayer, Yahweh, his adversaries shall be shattered, the Most High will thunder in heaven, Yahweh will judge the ends of the earth, he will give strength to his king, and exalt the power of his anointed. And that's exactly what we see happening right here. So David danced before Yahweh with all his strength. The dancing is only here in the next verse. The entire Deuteronomistic history, as Xiao notes, must refer to a skipping, prancing movement like that of a ram, although Falkman suggests that the term could mean snapped with his fingers. Xiao suggests, continuing, that it fits the description of Ugaritic poetry about the defeat of Baal's enemies. But we don't know that the authors of the story are trying to compare David's rise with other descriptions of other kings' rise or not. So it might fit that description, but it might not be intentional. It might simply be that the authors are using the standard descriptions, not just in Ugaritic but otherwise, for how kings in that era established the legitimacy of their reign. So he's dancing literally before the face of Yahweh. And notice there's no ark here now. So now it's just David directly with Yahweh, as we'll see in their conversation in chapter 7, when first it's mediated by the prophet Nathan, and then David will sit down and talk to Yahweh directly. So no ark to intervene between them here. How we're supposed to picture that isn't clear. David is girded with a linen ephod, and that's going to be key to what comes up. And we've seen ephod in 1 Samuel as priestly attire. It's only here in 2 Samuel. So as Falkelman notes, David has thus become the successor of the divinely acceptable Samuel. But what's interesting here is the text doesn't say how big that is. And when you look at art, and I'll show you this one image here, this is the only one I could find that actually showed what's implied by Michel's observation, not just here in verse 16, but we'll look at next video in verses 20 to 23, that David is practically naked in the streets before the servant girls. It must be that other artists are too modest, more modest than the biblical authors, probably from a Christian perspective that is modest about nakedness, and shows David in full attire and ephod that goes from foot to shoulder, and therefore misses the point of why Michal would be upset at him. So we're going to picture him like this, as if it's like a pair of shorts or almost like kilts. And it's the only time we see a non-priest, someone who's not formally a priest, wearing an ephod. We see the ephod held in a number of times. There were the priests that Doeg killed in 1 Samuel, where they were all wearing the ephod, but those were all officially priests. And David is not officially a priest, and yet he's certainly acting like one. So now we hear he's joined by all the house of Israel. And we saw the house of Israel in verse 5 when they were going up to the stronghold of Zion. And like with all these references, we have to wonder if the original author meant that to be literal. We can't really imagine that everybody from all the areas around what's Israel, this entire area, suddenly were gathered in the city of David to be around the ark. So it's certainly offering an exaggeration, but an expression of David has all the people with him, even if he certainly doesn't have all the people. Most of the people out here somewhere would hardly know what was happening, would they? So with shouting, which echoes what we hear in 1 Samuel 5 and 6, let's go back to that, in the first ark story. When the ark of the covenant of Yahweh came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout, so the earth resounded, which leads the Philistines to be afraid, as we see there. So here they're shouting in the city of David, and with the sound of the shofar, which we've seen a number of times from Saul and Joab. We'll see it next from Absalom and from Joab and Sheba and Joab yet again. And so we'll skip verse 16, as I noted, and we'll come back to that to move on here down to 17 to 19. And I'll read our verse here before we look at the quote from Piasky below. They brought in the ark of the Yahweh and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it, and David offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. A lot to look at there. As Piasky notes, in placing the ark in Jerusalem, David would have made known to surrounding populations that Yahweh's abode was no longer housed in the older Israelite center of Shiloh to the north, as we saw in 1 Samuel 1-4, but now resided in the city of David, located on the borders of Benjamin and Judah. If Jerusalem's natural and architectural features were capable of evoking a sense of power. So we hear that from him there. And as we note here, now the narrator says they brought. So it's no longer David acting alone. It's now they are bringing the ark in. And they set it in its place. And there's some very interesting words here. The term for set it matches exactly from 1 Samuel 5:2. The Philistines took the ark of God and set it into the house of Dagon and placed it beside Dagon. Exactly the same as what David does here, of course, but there's no house of Yahweh. There's simply the tent that he'd set up. Let's continue with the details. In its place, Makom here, and Makom from a Deuteronomistic history perspective is Jerusalem. We hear several times in Deuteronomy 6 in the mouth of Moses that when you celebrate the various feasts, you shall do it in the place that Yahweh has chosen for his name, which is plainly Jerusalem. And notice that Deuteronomy presents it as the place that Yahweh has chosen, rather than the place that David took from the Jebusites and tried to squeeze Yahweh into, which is what we'll see in chapter 7. So that's giving the big picture there from Deuteronomy. But here it's in its place. We don't know if that simply means it's in its place in Jerusalem, in the city of David. And then the writer continues to define that for us. Inside the tent that David had pitched for it. So we've seen tent a number of times, and we'll see tent in 1 Kings a number of times, and we'll also hear tent in the next chapter, in chapter 7, verse 6, when out of Yahweh's own mouth, that I have lived in a tent and a mishkan ever since I led the people out of Egypt. So the tent seems like the right place for the ark, but David will become dissatisfied with it as soon as he recognizes that he's in a house of cedar, and that seems undignified for Yahweh to be in a mere tent. The word for pitched here, nata lov here, is nata is 216 times in the Masoretic text, but in 2 Samuel it's associated with violence. As Essingler notes below, the ark is put in its place as though the tent that David staked out were its proper place, and the tent so meticulously engineered by divine revelation and built by no less than Moses were not. And that's the long description in Exodus 25 to 31 and 35 to 40. I would just dispute the one point that it's not the tent so meticulously engineered as the Mishkan, which is to say the box that holds the ark, that holds the tablets of the law, the Ten Commandments. So then David, again acting as priest, offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being, or shalom, offerings of shalom. And that leads us to look at how offerings have worked in Samuel. And that really tells its own plot. Because we saw in the beginning of 1 Samuel here, the Levites took down the ark of Yahweh, and where the ark is here now, and the people of Beth Shemesh offered burnt offerings and presented sacrifices on that day to Yahweh. So it starts with them, but then it goes to the Samuel and Saul story. So Samuel offers a sucking lamb as a whole burnt offering to Yahweh, and cried out. This is in the face of the people, feeling faint in the face of the Philistines, as you see here, but before they've chosen to ask for a king. Now they've chosen to ask for a king in 1 Samuel 10, and Samuel's working on controlling Saul, and so he tells Saul this, I will come down to you to present burnt offerings and offer sacrifices of shalom. 7 days you shall wait. But Saul doesn't wait because the people are slipping away, and so he offers them, and when Samuel confronts them, he says disingenuously, I forced myself and offered the burnt offering, and Samuel calls him a fool and then makes clear what we know now. Yahweh would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom will not continue. Yahweh has sought out a man after his own heart, and Yahweh has appointed him to be ruler over his people, because you have not kept what Yahweh commanded you. Now, that hadn't happened yet in 1 Samuel 13. We haven't even met David yet, but God's plan is already in place. And we'll hear the same thing 2 chapters later, but with an ironic statement. After Samuel has made these offerings, he now says to Saul, has Yahweh his great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Yahweh? Surely to obey is better than sacrifice. And notice he's not saying it's an either or. He's not saying Yahweh's not interested in burnt offerings like we might hear from the prophets, but more important is obedience than the burnt offerings. And so again, because you, Saul, have rejected the word of Yahweh, Yahweh has rejected you from being king. So now we turn to our immediate passage here. And the only other one in the book of Samuel are at the very end, and I was noting in an earlier verse the connection of the threshing floor of Araunah that we saw to two other threshing floors, including that of Nacon that we just saw earlier in this passage, is what the book of Chronicles takes as the place where from which Solomon will build the temple. But what we hear here is David built there an altar to Yahweh and offered burnt offerings and offerings of shalom. So Yahweh answered his supplication for the land, and the plague was averted. This was after David had foolishly called for a census, and Yahweh caused a plague because of the census. So this is to repent for the census. So we see that David is the one who offers these burnt offerings, and curiously in the books of Samuel, they're never offered by a priest. There's no priest doing that. But plainly what's at issue is David's successful offerings in contrast to Saul's unsuccessful ones that don't get Yahweh or Samuel to relent, and he loses the monarchy. So David continues here in the role of priest. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being or shalom, he blessed the people in the name of Yahweh of hosts, in the name of the military image of Yahweh. We saw earlier when David had inquired about going after the Philistines, the voice of Yahweh said, you'll hear the sound in the tops of the balsam trees, and that's Yahweh Sabaoth, the image of the heavenly army that is there to help David. It's a rare occasion we actually hear about an actual image of an angelic army, although we never actually hear or see it in the story. It's just Yahweh saying that David should listen for it. So he blesses them. And then what we see in verse 19 sounds good, but it's very specifically limited, and it's quite a contrast to what we see with Solomon. It's even a contrast to what we saw Abigail bring to David and his men when her foolish husband Nabal, meaning fool, was dissing David, and David is preparing to slaughter Nabal and all his men. We can see that in contrast to this one. So, and as my note below has, the relative poverty of the provisions underscores the local nature of the event from Halpern. And as Piasky notes, the threefold use of the numeral 1 by the narrator to describe these gifts permits no ambiguity. Though extended to all participants, the portion received by the gathering is of a very limited amount, whose singular nature colors the joyful occasion with a rather parsimonious hue. And that the case is that each of the us here is the Hebrew word ephod for one, and so I translated them here as one for each. So we distributed here, using halak here, we saw that one other time. Food, there's actually no word for food here. If you distribute among all the people these things. Among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, using a word for a positive word for crowd here, Haman, with Israel, surprising. As Halpern notes, a very unlikely event given the absence of real participation in David's reign among people with Israelite origin, as we'll see in 2 Samuel 23. And that's part of Halpern's bigger argument that this whole thing is a sham, that David and Solomon are, that David is a gang leader and that Solomon will be an Egyptian puppet to control Jerusalem and the environs on behalf of Egypt, as was often the case to put local puppet kings, as the Romans did in Jesus' time by putting Herod in charge of Judea. So we'll have to make that decision further on as we get into the Solomon story. But whether we take it as a literal event or as a narrative exaggeration or as a piece of propaganda, that's what we hear, naming both men and women, a rare synecdoche as Halpern notes, but indicating the extraordinary nature of the occasion. And to each, one cake of bread, which is say like one piece of matzah or pita bread, one piece of meat, it's hard to know how much that is, but just a piece of meat, and one raisin cake. So that's barely lunch. You know, one piece of bread, a piece of meat, and a few raisins is really a small amount for someone who's celebrating his reign. David will get richer, but he's not right now. And then all the people went back to their homes. And notice we don't hear thankfulness from them. We don't hear this means a commitment. They seem to receive it. He distributed it, so we can assume that they received it, but we hear no response. And the celebration seems to be over when David returns home to bless his household, but then he'll have to confront the anger of Saul's daughter, his wife Michal. We'll see that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.